The R-96 was designed during the mid-1930s in response to a requirement issued by the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM German Aviation Ministry, for a modern trainer. In a nation rebuilding its air force under the shadows of secrecy and ambition, the need for a revolutionary training aircraft had become paramount. Germany's aviation industry, restricted for years after the Great War, was now racing to catch up with the rest of the world. The story begins in 1936, when the aircraft manufacturer Arado received the call to create something extraordinary. A design team at the company, headed by the aeronautical engineer Walter Bloom, promptly designed a monoplane aircraft that featured all-metal construction and a low-mounted cantilevered wing. This wasn't going to be just another trainer. It was intended to bridge the dangerous gap between basic biplane trainers and the sophisticated combat aircraft that were beginning to emerge. The old ways of training pilots were becoming obsolete. Throughout the 1930s, most air forces still relied on open-cockpit biplanes that bore little resemblance to the modern fighters their students would eventually fly. It was designed to fill the gap between the biplanes used for basic training and the advanced monoplane fighters just entering service, in particular the Bf-109. This transition was proving deadly. Too many promising young pilots were being lost in training accidents when they jumped from simple trainers to high-performance combat aircraft. It was designed with Arado's standard forward-set tailfin, which reduced the occurrence of spins. The aircraft was envisaged to perform standard training, night flying, aerobatics, radio operator training, aerial reconnaissance, using photogrammatical cameras, and even bombing missions. Bloom and his team understood that they weren't just building a trainer. They were creating a classroom with wings that would prepare pilots for the complexities of modern warfare. In the autumn of 1936, the first prototype was completed. When it rolled out of the factory, it looked nothing like the trainers of old. Its sleek, all-metal construction gleamed in the light, and its low-wing design spoke of speed and modernity. But it was what happened next that would truly set hearts racing. The V1 was powered by an Argus as 10C inline engine and had the typical Arado tail, with the horizontal surfaces at the very rear and a tall fin and rudder just in front of them. During the initial taxi tests, everything seemed normal. The aircraft handled well on the ground, responding smoothly to the controls. Then came the moment of truth, the first flight. On the V1 prototype, the wheels retracted outwards, but this meant that the gap between the wheels was quite small. As test pilot watched the ground fall away beneath him on that first flight, he reached for a lever that no German trainer had possessed before. With a mechanical whir and the hiss of hydraulics, the landing gear began to move. But something unexpected happened. The outward retracting landing gear was replaced by wider track design to fulfill training safety requirements. This seemingly small detail would become one of the most significant changes in the aircraft's development. The prototype R-96V1 was fitted with a main undercarriage that retracted outwards into the wing, but this was soon repositioned with inward retracting landing gear legs in order to widen the track. The engineers quickly realized that student pilots needed more stability during landing, not less. During 1937, testing of the first batch of prototypes proceeded positively. That same year, Ernst Judith, chief of the technical office, TAMT, flew one of the early R-96's. Judith, the famous World War I ace turned aviation official, was known for his exacting standards. When he climbed out of the cockpit after his test flight, his approval carried enormous weight. The aircraft wasn't just good, it was exactly what Germany needed. To suit its principal use as a trainer, the design of the aircraft incorporated various safety features. All of the flight control surfaces were aerodynamically balanced and could be readily adjusted mid-flight. The flaps would automatically deploy, based on airspeed, if the trainee pilot forgot to do so. These features might seem standard today, but in 1937 they were revolutionary. The automatic flaps, in particular, would save countless student pilots from potentially fatal stall accidents. During 1939, an initial batch of R-96A aircraft was produced. These largely resembled the sixth prototype, albeit being powered by the weaker Argus as 10 engine instead, largely due to insufficient numbers of As-410 engines being available at that time. This batch was subsequently followed by the R-96B, the first major production series, which were equipped the more powerful Argus as 410 engine. When the first production R-96s began arriving at Luftwaffe training schools in late 1939, the reaction was immediate and profound. Instructor pilots who had spent years teaching on antiquated biplanes suddenly found themselves confronted with an aircraft that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. Starting from its first delivery in late 1939, the Arado R-96 was the Luftwaffe's standard advanced trainer throughout the Second World War. The most shocking feature for many wasn't the enclosed cockpit or the all-metal construction. It was the retractable landing gear. It was a cantilever aircraft with a monocoque fuselage, a light duraluminum skin, and a retractable undercarriage. For student pilots who had learned to fly on fixed-gear biplanes, the concept of wheels that disappeared into the aircraft seemed almost like magic. Picture young Wilhelm Schmidt, fresh from basic training, approaching his first R-96 on a foggy morning at a training base near Munich. His instructor, a veteran of the Legion Condor, walked him around the aircraft, pointing out its features. When they reached the landing gear, the instructor paused. "This," he said, tapping the wheel with his boot, "is what separates the old world from the new." During the pre-flight briefing, instructors would spend considerable time explaining the landing gear system. While the main landing gear and brakes were hydraulically powered, manual actuation via a hand pump was available in the event of a hydraulic failure. This backup system was crucial. It meant that even if the sophisticated hydraulics failed, a student wouldn't be trapped in the air with no way to lower the wheels. The first time student pilots actuated the landing gear retraction system, their reactions were almost universal, a mixture of amazement and apprehension. The hydraulic whine as the wheels tucked into their wells, the slight change in the aircraft's handling as the drag decreased, the clean lines of the wing without protruding wheels, it all contributed to a feeling that they were flying something truly special. By the end of 1940, the R-96 was becoming a common sight at many Germany pilot training schools, where they were often regarded as being relatively rugged, easy to fly and maintain, and technologically up-to-date aircraft. But this widespread adoption didn't come without challenges. Many of the older instructors, men who had learned their craft in the Great War, struggled to adapt to the new technology. There were incidents, of course. Student pilots would forget to lower the landing gear, leading to belly landings that damaged the aircraft but rarely injured the crew, a testament to the R-96's robust construction. Others would lower the gear too late or retract it too early on takeoff. Each mistake became a learning opportunity, and gradually the procedures became second nature. Powered by a range of engines, including the Argus As-10 and the more powerful Argus As-410, the R-96 exhibited impressive performance capabilities that made it an ideal platform for training aspiring pilots. With a top speed exceeding 300 km/h and a service ceiling of over 6,000 meters, the R-96 offered a perfect balance of speed, agility, and altitude performance, enabling trainee pilots to hone their skills effectively. The performance leap from the old biplanes was staggering. Students who had struggled to coax their previous trainers above 200 kilometers per hour suddenly found themselves approaching speeds that would have been considered remarkable for fighters just a decade earlier. The retractable gear played a crucial role in this performance. With the wheels tucked away, the R-96 was as clean and efficient as many operational fighters of the period. The R-96 quickly became commonplace at fighter pilot schools, where they were typically used for advanced, night, and instrument flying training. They were frequently described as being relatively rugged, easy to fly and maintain, and technologically up to date. But it wasn't just the performance that impressed. It was how the aircraft prepared pilots for what was to come. The transition from the R-96 to operational fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 became remarkably smooth. Pilots who had mastered the R-96's retractable gear, enclosed cockpit, and modern instruments found the jump to combat aircraft far less daunting than their predecessors had with fixed-gear trainers. The accident rate during operational conversion dropped dramatically. One of the defining characteristics of the R-96 was its innovative design, which combined a robust airframe with advanced features for enhanced stability and maneuverability. The aircraft featured a low-wing monoplane configuration with a streamlined fuselage and a distinctive inverted gull wing design. This unique wing layout not only provided excellent visibility for the pilot, but also improved lift characteristics, allowing for smoother takeoffs and landings. As the war progressed, the R-96 proved its worth time and again. The Luftwaffe used the R-96 aircraft for advanced night instrument flying training duties with the pilot training schools, fighter training wings, fighter training and replacement units, and the officer cadet schools. Numbers were also supplied to the Axis air forces of Hungary and Romania. Each nation that received the aircraft was impressed by its capabilities, particularly the retractable landing gear that seemed so advanced compared to their existing trainers. The training routine at a typical Luftwaffe flight school in 1942 would begin before dawn. Students would gather in the briefing room, where instructors would outline the day's exercises. For those transitioning to the R-96, special emphasis was placed on the landing gear procedures. Fahrwerk ein, gear up, and Fahrwerk aus, gear down became mantras repeated countless times. In the air, students would practice the gear cycle repeatedly, up and down, until the motion became as natural as breathing. They learned to feel the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior, the slight nose-down tendency as the gear retracted, the increase in drag as it extended. They learned to listen for the reassuring thunk of the gear locking into place, to check the mechanical indicators that confirmed the wheels were properly secured. The technology of the R-96 was ahead of its time when it was adopted by the Luftwaffe in 1940. 13 fighter training squadrons were equipped with the R-96B and tasked with training pilots who were destined to replace those lost in combat for the duration of the war. As losses mounted on all fronts, the pressure on training units intensified. The R-96 had to produce combat-ready pilots faster than ever before. The aircraft rose to the challenge magnificently. Its forgiving handling characteristics meant that students could push themselves harder without the catastrophic consequences that might occur in less stable aircraft. The retractable gear, once a source of anxiety, became a tool for building confidence. Students who mastered the R-96's systems knew they could handle anything the enemy might throw at them. Once quantity production of the type had been established, Arado's test group studied various means to more economically produce the aircraft. It was hoped that production time could be roughly halved from 110 hours to 60-65. By 1943, Germany's declining military situation and intense demands for key materials motivated Arado's started development of a new derivative of the R-96 that made greater use of lower-grade non-strategic metals and wood. As the war turned against Germany, even the R-96 had to adapt. The sophisticated aircraft that had shocked trainees with its modernity now had to be simplified to keep pace with production demands. Yet even as materials became scarce and production was dispersed to avoid bombing, the essential character of the aircraft, including its retractable landing gear, remained intact. Manufacture was transferred to the Junkers subsidiary, Ago Flugzeugwerk at Oschersleben, southwest of Magdeburg in central Germany, in 1940, and from mid-1941 to the Czech company Avia, which was joined in the program in 1944 by the Prague-based Letov organization. Czech production continued until 1948, supplying aircraft to the Czech Air Force under the designation Avia C.2B. The production story of the R-96 reflects the broader narrative of the war. What began in purpose-built German factories gradually shifted to occupied territories as Allied bombing intensified. Czech workers who had once built their own aircraft now found themselves assembling R-96s, marveling at the German trainers' sophisticated systems even as they labored under occupation. In the Czech factories, the retractable landing gear mechanisms proved particularly challenging to manufacture. The precision required for the hydraulic systems tested the limits of wartime production. Yet the workers, many of them skilled aviation craftsmen, took pride in their work. They understood that every properly functioning landing gear might mean one more pilot who would survive their training. However, development were deliberately constrained by the French, while the launch of the Allied invasion of France during the following year forced the Germans to shift production of the R-396 to Czechoslovakia instead. The French workers, ordered to build a wooden version of the R-96, designated the R-396, found ways to slow production without attracting too much attention. Small acts of sabotage, mistakes in assembly, missing parts, all contributed to delays that the Germans found increasingly frustrating. As 1944 dawned, the situation for German pilot training had become desperate. Fuel shortages meant that flight hours were severely restricted. Many students who would have had dozens of hours practicing landing gear operations now had to learn faster with less margin for error. The R-96's forgiving nature became more crucial than ever. With a total of roughly 3,400 operational planes produced, the R-96 is also one of the most manufactured German aircraft. Nearly 3,000 were produced before the end of the war, mostly by Avia and Letov in Czechoslovakia, where production still continued after the war. These numbers tell only part of the story. Each aircraft represented dozens of pilots trained, hundreds of landing gear cycles completed, thousands of successful transitions from training to combat. The human stories behind these statistics are compelling. Take Fritz Müller, a farm boy from Bavaria who had never seen an airplane up close before reporting for pilot training in 1943. His first encounter with the R-96's retractable gear left him speechless. Within months, he was teaching other students the intricate dance of gear retraction and extension, preparing them for the FW-190 fighters they would soon fly in defense of the Reich. Or consider Maria Hoffman, one of the few women who flew the R-96 as a ferry pilot, delivering trainers from factories to airfields. She later recalled the satisfaction of performing a perfect gear retraction, the aircraft transforming from an ungainly ground-bound machine to a sleek aerial thoroughbred in seconds. It never got old, she would say years later. That moment when the wheels tucked away and you felt truly free. The aircraft's relatively lightweight construction made it vulnerable to damage from enemy fire, especially during combat missions where it lacked adequate armor protection. Additionally, as the war progressed and technological advancements led to the development of more advanced trainer aircraft, the R-96 gradually became obsolete compared to its contemporaries. By late 1944, the limitations of the R-96 were becoming apparent. Allied aircraft were growing more sophisticated by the month, and the gap between trainer and combat aircraft was widening again. The retractable gear that had once seemed so advanced now appeared almost quaint compared to the tricycle landing gear of American aircraft or the sophisticated systems of late-war German jets. Yet the R-96 soldiered on, performing duties far beyond its original design. Some were pressed into service as light attack aircraft, their training wings carrying small bombs. Others became hack aircraft, ferrying officers between increasingly isolated commands. In each role, the retractable landing gear that had once shocked trainees proved its worth, allowing the aircraft to achieve speeds that fixed-gear aircraft couldn't match. The winter of 1944 to 45 brought new challenges. Hydraulic fluid froze in the harsh conditions, leaving landing gear stuck in position. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as spare parts vanished. Students learned to manually pump the gear down, their arms aching from the effort, understanding that in combat, such physical exhaustion could mean the difference between life and death. During the Battle of Berlin, on the evening of 28 April 1945, test pilot Hannah Rach flew with the Luftwaffe head Generalfield Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim out from Berlin in an R-96. This flight, one of the last operational uses of the R-96 in German hands, demonstrated the aircraft's enduring capability. Even as the Third Reich crumbled, the trainer that had prepared thousands of pilots performed one final service. Rach, Germany's most famous female pilot, knew the R-96 intimately. She had demonstrated its capabilities at air shows, shown skeptical officials what the aircraft could do. Now, with Soviet forces closing in, she relied on her knowledge of every system, including the landing gear that would need to function perfectly for their desperate escape. The gear came down smoothly, locking into place as Russian shells exploded nearby. Even in the chaos of Berlin's fall, German engineering held true. Test pilot Hannah Rach flew with then Luftwaffe head Generalfield Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim out from Berlin in an R-96 trainer from an improvised airstrip in the Tiergarten while under Soviet fire. The improvised runway in the Tiergarten, Berlin's Grand Park turned battlefield, was barely suitable for takeoff. Debris littered the ground, and the surface was cratered from artillery strikes. The R-96's robust landing gear, designed to handle student pilots' rough landings, proved equal to this ultimate test. As Rach powered up the engine, the familiar vibration of the R-96 provided a moment of normalcy in the apocalyptic scene. The landing gear, retracted for perhaps the 100,000th time across all R-96s ever built, tucked neatly into the wings. Below, the burning capital of the Reich fell away. The trainer had become an escape vehicle, its modern features allowing it to outrun the end of an era. Shadow production of the R-96 was undertaken by Letov and the Avia factory in occupied Czechoslovakia. They continued to manufacture the type for several years after the end of the conflict under the designation of Avia C2B. A wooden version, known as the R396, was built in France and was designated the SIPA S.10. The story didn't end with Germany's surrender in May 1945. In Czechoslovakia, production lines that had been turning out R-96s for the Luftwaffe continued their work, now building aircraft for a liberated nation. The Czech designation C2B couldn't disguise the aircraft's German origins, but Czech pilots didn't care. They recognized quality when they saw it, and the retractable landing gear that had amazed German trainees now impressed a new generation of Czech aviators. In France, the wooden R396 variant found new life as the SIPA S.10. French production version of R396, 28 produced. Modified version of S.10, powered by Renault 12S, French-built Argus as 411, 50 built for the French Air Force. French pilots who had fought against German aircraft now learned to fly in machines based on German designs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but pragmatism prevailed. The retractable gear worked just as well under French roundels as it had under German crosses. Further developments were the SIPA 111 armed version and SIPA S12, a metal version. 58 machines were produced until 1958. The S.11 was operated with some success in Algeria, carrying machine guns, rockets, and light bombs. In the harsh conditions of North Africa, the R-96's descendant proved its versatility once again. The retractable gear, designed for European training fields, handled rough desert strips with surprising capability. Czech production presented its own stories. Workers who had built R-96s under German occupation now continued the work for their own air force. They made improvements, fixed long-standing issues, and adapted the design to post-war needs. The landing gear mechanisms, refined through years of experience, became even more reliable. Czech pilots training on the C-2B in 1947 experienced the same wonder at the retracting wheels that their German counterparts had felt 8 years earlier. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Over 400 C-2Bs were built in Czechoslovakia after the war, adding to the wartime production. Each represented continuity amid chaos. a thread connecting the aviation world of the 1930s to the jet age dawning in the 1950s. The retractable landing gear, once revolutionary, had become simply normal, a transformation that marked how far aviation had come. Veterans of the Luftwaffe, now scattered across a divided Germany, would gather in small groups and share their memories. The R-96 featured prominently in these recollections. They remembered their first flights, the nervousness of their initial landing gear retraction, the pride of mastering the aircraft systems. For many, the R-96 represented the last moment of innocence before war consumed their youth. Karl Hoffmann, who had instructed on R-96s from 1941 to 1945, later wrote in his memoirs, "The landing gear was our introduction to the future. Every time those wheels came up, we felt we were part of something larger than ourselves. We were flying the future, and the future had no room for fixed wheels dragging through the air. Looking back, I realized we were training for a war that technology would soon make obsolete. But in that moment, with the gear tucked away and the aircraft clean and fast, we felt invincible." Nearly 3,000 were produced before the end of the war, mostly by Avia and Letov in Czechoslovakia, where production still continued after the war. The particular aircraft our model depicts was captured by British troops and used by the newly formed No.435 Disarmament Servicing and Recovery Unit of the RAF in Germany after the war as the squadron's hack. The Allies, examining captured R-96s, were impressed despite themselves. British test pilots, accustomed to their own advanced trainers, acknowledged the German aircraft's qualities. The retractable gear system, in particular, drew praise for its reliability and clever engineering. Reports noted that student pilots could master the system quickly, and the manual backup provided peace of mind. American evaluators were more critical, pointing out that their own trainers had moved to tricycle landing gear, which was even easier for students to handle. Yet they couldn't deny the R-96's effectiveness. Thousands of German pilots had learned their craft on these aircraft, and the retractable gear had been just one part of a comprehensive training system that had produced formidable adversaries. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the R-96 and its derivatives gradually faded from frontline service. In Czechoslovakia, the last C-2Bs were retired in the mid-1950s, replaced by jet trainers that made even the once revolutionary R-96 seem antique. The French variants soldiered on a bit longer, some seeing combat in Algeria, their retractable gear allowing them to operate from rough strips where fixed-gear aircraft would have struggled. Museums began acquiring examples, recognizing the R-96's historical significance. It is the most built version, with a total of 1,381 aircraft constructed. This aircraft is reconstructed from multiple R-96 plane wrecks. Various parts like the fuel tanks, engine, rudder, hood, seats and steering controls come from an Arado R-96B1, manufactured in 1943, that was captured in Sweden in the summer of 1944 and demolished in 1954. Today, preserved R-96s can be found in museums across Europe. The Arado R-96 is on display at the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin. Visitors, accustomed to modern aircraft where retractable landing gear is standard, often pass by without realizing they're looking at a revolution. But for those who know the history, who understand what it meant for a training aircraft to have such sophisticated systems in 1939, the R-96 represents a pivotal moment in aviation history. The last surviving pilots who trained on the R-96 are now in their 90s, their memories of those training days growing distant. Yet when asked about their experiences, many still remember the landing gear with particular clarity. Hans Dietrich, who soloed on an R-96 in 1944 at age 18, recalled in a 2018 interview, "The first time I retracted the gear on my own, without an instructor beside me, I felt like I had crossed a threshold. The wheels came up, and suddenly I wasn't flying a training aircraft anymore. I was flying a real airplane, a modern airplane. That feeling of the gear locking into place, I can still feel it in my bones." The engineering legacy of the R-96's landing gear lived on in unexpected ways. The hydraulic systems pioneered for the trainer influenced post-war civilian aircraft design. The emphasis on fail-safe mechanisms, on manual backups, on making complex systems student-proof. These lessons learned from the R-96 program influenced training aircraft design for decades. Modern flight simulators include remarkably accurate R-96 models, complete with functioning retractable landing gear. Young aviation enthusiasts, born decades after the last R-96 flew operationally, can experience something of what those wartime trainees felt. The sequence remains the same. Check hydraulic pressure, move the gear lever, monitor the transition, verify the locks. It's a ritual that connects past and present, a reminder that every technological advance was once revolutionary to someone. The story of how German trainees were shocked by the Arado R-96's retractable landing gear is more than just a curious historical footnote. It represents a moment when aviation took a giant leap forward, when the future arrived in the form of wheels that could disappear into wings. It's a story of young men confronting new technology, of instructors adapting to change, of an aircraft that bridged two eras of flight. But perhaps most importantly, it's a human story. Behind every landing gear retraction was a young pilot, far from home, learning skills that might save their life or end it. The shock of that first retraction gave way to familiarity, then to muscle memory, then to the automatic responses that combat demanded. The R-96, with its revolutionary retractable landing gear, didn't just train pilots. It transformed farm boys and city kids into aviators who could handle the most sophisticated aircraft of their time. As we look back from our modern perspective, where retractable landing gear is so commonplace as to be unremarkable, it's worth remembering that moment of shock and wonder when young German trainees first saw those wheels disappear. In that moment, the future of aviation was born, one retraction at a time. The R-96 stands as a testament to the power of innovation in education, showing that sometimes the best way to prepare people for the future is to give them a taste of it in training. The last word belongs to Wilhelm Bauer, who trained on the R-96 in 1943 and survived the war to become a civilian flying instructor. Shortly before his death in 2019, he reflected, "People ask me about the war, about combat, about fear and courage. But you know what I remember most clearly? That first time the landing gear came up on the R-96. In that moment, I understood that I was living in a new age. The shock wasn't fear, it was recognition. We were flying machines our fathers couldn't have imagined, and those disappearing wheels were proof that anything was possible. Even now, when I see a modern airliner pull up its gear after takeoff, I think of that first time in the R-96. Some shocks stay with you forever, especially the ones that show you the future.